me introduce our speaker. Carl Lounsbury is professor at the College of William and Mary, which I think is the oldest college.
Next to Harvard.
Oh, next to Harvard, second oldest.
Yes.
All right, college in the United States. He is an expert on 17th, 18th century architecture, especially ecclesiastical architecture, religious architecture, which makes him absolutely perfect for this talk today. And Allison and I just had lunch with him and his wife and his friend at the diner, and we talked a little bit about this stuff, and I can confirm he knows a lot about this stuff. So I will turn it over to him, and if we have questions at the end, we should have time for that. All right, thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you, Robert, and I hope you can hear me from this perch. It could all go wrong very quickly, so I don't want to get too animated. I'm going to try to be a Quaker. Are there any Quakers in the house? Any? Okay, good. So I hope not to offend you too much, but I will be talking about the plan of this building here and how it evolved and where it came from, because this is a fabulous building. This is now the fourth time I've been here. I first came in 1987 to record it, along with Creek. No, I didn't go to Creek, but I did go to Crum Elbow and Oblong, and those are fine meeting houses, and you'll see them at the end of the program. So this is really about one thing. It's how this plan reflects changes in Quaker philosophy, because Quaker philosophy in dealing with both meetings and discipline change over time. It's not static. Many of you know Quakers now as social justice and working for various issues, and that was certainly part of the way Quakers evolved, but they were not always like that. There were many Quaker slaveholders in the 17th and 18th century. So it is an evolution, and I want to talk about the evolution of this plan and how it reflects the importance of equality of men and women. So that's the premise, and I hope it all works fine. So please let me indulge in reading this, because we'll get through it much faster and we can ask questions. After fire destroyed its earlier building in 1780-81, the Nine Partners Monthly Meeting erected this capacious two-story brick meeting house, which cost more than 800 pounds. It was a very expensive building at the time. It was a substantial investment which had produced a lasting legacy of Quakerism in this part of New York, and you express that here today for being here. Solidly built and well preserved with few later alterations, the meeting house measures 60.5 feet in length and 43.5 feet in depth. The south entrance facade is laid in Flemish bond. I hope you see Flemish bond on the screen. And while the two gables in the backs are what we call 1-to-2 bond, so a slight difference, but the good side is put forward. It's done in workmanlike craftsmanship. The brickwork is set on a low foundation and rises to the eaves with no projecting water table or string course, so it's a pretty flat facade. The apertures have segmental arches. Those are semicircular, or not quite semicircular, but part of a circle arches, and unmolded architraves. There's no moldings on the outside of the doors or windows. Emblematic of the unembellished aesthetic of Quaker design. The four plain batten doors that you see, right? Two on the south and one more. Here we go. How's that?
Yes.
Got doors? Good. One door, that's all we need. Are both double sheave, that is, it has double depth. The interior is exemplary of Quaker aesthetics of sufficiency, where unpainted woodwork and fittings are well crafted, paired of superfluous moldings and turnings. The pine paneling, doors, benches, and darkened with age contrast with the white plaster walls. Worshippers entered the meeting house through two doorways on the south side, which opened into a 4-foot wide vestibule. That's the new part that was introduced in the 19th century. and now provides access to the two staircases going to the southwest and southeast corners, which lead to the gallery. The stairs originally were open strings that rose along the south wall and then turned back 45 degrees angle, which you may see up there, toward the center of the meeting house. The newels are square and there are no balusters to support the handrail. Seating in the gallery stretches around the four walls, a single row along the back north wall showing the elders over the elders bench in multiple rows on the west, south, and east side, rising in step tiers. There is a wonderful array of graffiti. I hope you see some graffiti here. Not yet.
Yes.
You see graffiti. Carved into the breastwork, the railings, and the benches. The work of industrious boys over several generations, revealing their innermost thoughts with etchings made by pen knives featuring initials, names, sailing ships, houses, animals. How they managed to do this woodwork during the long, quiet hours of worship without disturbing the meeting requires an uncanny skill that is now lost in time. When bored with their handiwork, these young attendees turned their attention to those who sat on the other side of the gallery partition. The division of 7 rows of seating on the south side of the meeting house consisted of vertical pine boards. In each row of benches in the boys' side, a peephole at a 12-year-old level enabled furtive glimpses of the girls' gallery. Each of the holes was then covered over with a small sheet of tin, which was nailed in 4 corners, which was in turn reopened from the boys' side. Temptation combined with the tedium has left the mark here to remind us that not all of those who sat on these benches in this meeting house sat in reverent contemplation of divine will. Or maybe they did. On the ground floor, the meeting house is divided into 2 rooms, separated by a sliding paneled partition and vertical sheathing in the center. The panels are unmolded. Women sat on the west room and men in the east room. A double door near the center of the partition allowed access between the 2 rooms over here on the ground floor, but there was no official communication between the 2 rooms and the gallery. Benches are unfixed and have slightly sloped back rails. To keep members warm during the winter months, 2 early stoves sat in the middle of each of the 2 rooms that we see here still. The introduction of such heating devices did not meet with universal approval among many Quaker meeting houses. At Third Haven Meeting House in Talbot County, Maryland, one older woman disapproved of the installation of a stove in the mid-1780s, considering it the slippery slope of backsliding complacency. Despite her objections, the women's business meeting approved the decision when she was absent from one session. When she entered the meeting house on her return and saw it standing in the center of the room, she promptly passed out. When revived, she was informed that it had not been lit. She relented, and her later decision was warmly received. At 9 partners, 3 rows of facing benches up here are arranged in tiers against the north wall and are backed and flanked by horizontal beaded sheathing boards secured by unobtrusive clasped T-head nails, little tiny nails. The benches rest on unshaped supports, have straight backs and vertical board at the top, which is in short open space framed with unmolded rails and stiles. Rear doors in the north facade, did you see the rear doors? Good. Provide a separate entrance for elders, traveling missionaries, and weighty friends. Those individuals who had the propensity for speaking the truth at meetings, inspired by the inner light revealed to them by God. The exterior stairs and landings associated with these openings no longer survive. Long bereft of their means of access, these doorways, standing high in the wall here at 9 partners and at other meeting houses, have inspired curious explanations for their purpose. Some interpretations have suggested that these elevated openings act as a loading dock or perhaps a drive-up drop-off for women who are alighted from their buggies or wagons directly into the doorways here, which no doubt would have been an amazing feat of skill on the part of the drivers and the passengers. When here many years ago, I found no evidence of scars in the brickwork for axles, wheels, or side view mirrors. So there's no evidence for that. And it's a story that was told to me, again, many years ago here, but also in other meeting houses. So a lot of the Quakers have forgotten what these doors are really for. What is novel, and as I mentioned at the beginning, justly celebrated about Nine Partners Meeting House is its plan, which is a revolutionary innovation in New York when it was constructed in 1780. The builders of the new structure made a radical break from the arrangement of Quaker meeting houses that had been erected in the region since the beginning of the 18th century. The form is one of the oldest surviving examples of a symmetrically arranged meeting house in the Hudson Valley. It was the first meeting house in the area to conceive of the heretofore separate and mostly unequal meeting spaces for men and women as a unified, balanced pair of rooms. Instead of one central doorway flanked by a window on either side and perhaps a doorway on each of the two gable ends, this new plan doubled the old formula and had paired entrances on the long walls, which allowed for two equal-sized rooms being 28 feet by 39 feet in depth. Thank you. One for men on the east, and women on the west side, divided by the retractable partitions whose panel would be closed during business meetings and open during regular worship services. The segregation explicitly expressed in the double symmetry of the entrance facades with their paired doors that were symbolic of the Quaker belief in equality of the two genders in religious matters. It also expressed the recent growth of the importance of business meetings, for it was these gender-segregated spaces that men and women met separately to discuss often contentious matters that redefined their relationship to the wider world as friends challenged or repudiated contemporary politics, social mores, and moral issues, and tried to reconcile themselves personally as well as corporately in practices and policies which conformed to Quaker positions established by the leading lights in their yearly meetings. Business meetings had been a part of Quaker life from the beginning in America in the third quarter of the 17th century. In 1672, is George Fox up there? The leading figure of the organization of English Quakerism, George Fox, arrived for the first time in the American mainland after he visited Barbados, where there was a Quaker colony there. 10 years before William Penn received the proprietary grant for Pennsylvania, gatherings of Quakers had already been coalesced in places where no established religion held sway. In New England, Rhode Island became a refuge from the intolerant Calvinist Puritans of Massachusetts and Connecticut. In the southern colonies, a band of Quakers established a meeting in the Albemarle region of North Carolina, which George Fox visited in his first visit to British America. The third place of Quakerism thrived was in the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, in Talbot County on the eastern shore, and in Anne Arundel County on the western shore. In the area that would later become the new capital of the colony of Annapolis, Fox visited a settlement known as Providence, where members of the sect had erected a meeting house, which he noted in his travel diary was not large enough to hold many people, so they met outside. For several days during the spring of 1672, he presided over the initial yearly meeting in the province. Over a 5-day period, he introduced the hierarchical system of Quaker meetings that were subordinate to each other. At the local level were particular or preparatory meetings for worship. He observed that, quote, monthly meetings encompassed the smaller preparative meetings who were met together and there were once-a-month meetings, and then there were quarterly meetings, included so many monthly meetings as many under the right direction, most usually meeting together every 3 months. and the yearly meeting, which is composed of many quarterly meetings, as many most conveniently attend, the same, each of which have their respective powers and service for the well-ordered of the society and the advancement of truth and righteousness, end quote. Fox instructed them to organize men and women's business meetings as these various levels that would be disciplinary instruments changed with conveying to individuals the principles and conduct of the membership. Preserved in a manuscript book presented by George Fox to the first yearly meeting in Maryland in the spring of 1672, there are 20 written pages describing rules for members of the society to follow and commentary with biblical citations by Fox, laying out how friends were to address issues such as marriage, dress, household obligations, servants, discipline, and race relations. These guidelines were written in Barbados for the women's meeting, and then they were sent as a gift. You see a gift to the Maryland up there? Yes. Quaker women in Maryland. This material was intended as an instructional guide for the women's business meetings. These sessions were given the authority to admonish and disown those who did not conform to them. Although established in the late 17th century, women's business meetings seldom delved into these divisive issues outlined by Fox. Women's meetings, many of which had been little more than perfunctory gatherings, lasted less than an hour and were sparsely attended in some places. The record book of Women at Third Haven monthly meeting in Talbot County in the early 18th century frequently summarized gatherings as, quote, no business appears for entry. In other words, they didn't have anything to say. The few minutes from these early meetings generally addressed the suitability of marriage partners or the occasional ill will of neighbors who were admonished to mend their ways. Excuse me. A little warm up here. Given the infrequency and brevity of their meetings, women conducted their business in a variety of makeshift spaces. Often they met at individual houses, but they also met at the Third Haven Meeting House, though on separate days from the men's monthly business meetings. The earliest meeting houses in America varied from place to place in terms of plan and materials, as there was no established English form that might be replicated by immigrants to the New World in the late 17th century. Many of these earliest English meeting houses were converted cottages, stables, and other buildings which contained main room where men and women sat together for worship and perhaps a smaller ancillary room for women's business meetings, but oftentimes not. Blue Idol in Coolham in West Sussex was converted farmhouse from the 1580s, where Quakers, including William Penn, began to meet in the late 17th century under severe restrictions, calling little attention to their conventicles. Large purpose-built two-story meeting houses, such as the one at Brigg Flats, built in 1675 in Cumbria, in the north of England, where George Fox first began his missionary work, was fitted out in the 1680s, featuring a large meeting room on the ground floor and stairs leading to an enclosed room at one end where women's business meetings occurred. The same pattern appears at Jordan's in Buckinghamshire, built in 1688, shortly after James II's Declaration of Indulgence, which allowed Quakers to openly erect meeting houses for the first time. Built of brick, it is rectangular space lit on the northwest side walls, and the main door is on the longer west wall near the south gable end. The walls of the meeting space are plastered above a simple paneled dado, probably dating to the early 18th century, which ramps up at the north end behind the elder's bench enclosed by a railing. Reached by a short flight of steps, at the opposite south end of the room is a gallery, originally used for women's business meetings, which had vertical sliding shutters between the oak posts, which were closed during the deliberations. Jordan's is also known for its cemetery, which many important Quakers are buried, including William Penn. The English pattern was replicated in early America. The segregation of men and women during their business meetings was treated in a variety of manners. As in England, A number of early American meeting houses consisted of two unequal-sized spaces in the meeting house arranged back to back and separated by a partition with separate doors into each room. There was a facing or elder's bench in the larger of the two rooms where men and women would gather for worship, then separate by an aisle in the center. For business meetings, women withdrew to a smaller room, as was the case at the Stone Marion Meeting House in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, which was built in the very early 18th century. The women gathered there in a smaller south room in this T-shaped structure to conduct their business. Later examples of this back-to-back arrangement appear at the Bradford Meeting House in Chester County, Pennsylvania, erected in 1765. I hope you see it, yes. Originally, the plan consisted of a large north room measuring 24 by 30 feet, facing the benches against one gable end for the worship of men's meetings, with doorways on the longer east and west walls near the back of the space, which was separated by a partition from the smaller 19 by 34-foot south room, which was used for the women's business meetings, where, like at Marion, there was no facing benches. After a fire in 1788, the partition was reoriented to create a symmetrically arranged interior with near equal-sized rooms, which had become the standard pattern in this part of Pennsylvania in the late 18th century. Another example of this back-to-back is the small Chichester Meeting House in neighboring Delaware County, again in Pennsylvania, was built in 1769, still retains its back-to-back arrangement. The smaller west room still retains a fireplace in the corner to provide warmth when women gathered there for their business meetings. A second plan type was the one that had smaller one-room additions built against the main meeting house that was used for women's business meetings. Such was the case in the small wing erected on the east end of the 1718 Radnor Meeting House in Delaware County. This was a common solution that Quakers also used outside the Delaware Valley. The two-story framed 39 by 29-foot Salesville Meeting House erected in Lincoln, Rhode Island in 1704 had a heated one-story 22 by 26 room built 65 years later on the west gable end. This women's meeting room was heated by a stove at one gable end. The third quarter of the 18th century marked a turning point. You see a turning point? Says turning point. One more? Turning point. This is how I keep people awake. One that started in the Delaware Valley, and it would eventually affect the arrangement of meeting houses south and north of that area. In the 1750s, a number of friends in the Delaware Valley began to increasingly question the relationship of their society to secular affairs and called for a stricter adherence to an aesthetic life and emulation of the spirituality associated with the earlier generations of friends from the 17th century. During this era, Quakers formally withdrew from civil government in Pennsylvania in 1756 in opposition to the appropriation of funds for war against native tribes on the frontier. They heightened their opposition to slavery, renewed their advocacy for nonviolent resolution of conflict, and frowned upon military service. These reforming Quakers leaders wished to set their sect apart from the wider culture by their many public testimonies. They lobbied for prison reform and established their own schools to educate their children. Men such as John Woolman of Mount Holly, New Jersey, and Anthony Benezet of Philadelphia and others traveled widely to meetings throughout the colonies, calling for its members to return to the plain ways, dress, and customs embodied by the spirit of their English founder of the sect, George Fox, in the late 17th century. Gradually, this growing concern for redefining their core beliefs of Quakers led to a greater emphasis on monitoring the behavior of members through their business meetings. The yearly meeting in Philadelphia issued a set of instructions and queries that gauged members' adherence to Quaker principles and discipline and required written reports from various meetings. In 1767, at the Third Haven monthly meeting, a letter was sent to American Quakers from the influential London meeting and the yearly meeting to Maryland Friends. Quote, respecting buying and keeping of slaves was read in this meeting, and copies of it were directed to be handed down to the several particular meetings and read to them, so that a unified policy on slavery by the Society of Friends would be known to all members. When called to task for breaking these principles, Quakers could never plead ignorance. This monitoring of behavior turned inward on members of the meeting itself. As many may be expected halfway through this lecture, a committee had been established at Third Haven Meeting House in Maryland in the 1780s to examine the cause of drowsiness during services. This is a chance to wake you up. A spokesman for the group reported that they had given much thought to its resolution, but admitted, quote, the weakness on the account still remains, which begins to weightily consider it appears to be a solid mind on this meeting to continue to proceed in this service as truth may point on the way. In other words, they're saying we need more time to figure out how to deal with this drowsiness issue. Several months later, the Friends appointed to the case reported that they still had the matter under consideration, quote, no doubt promising to keep it on their agenda a little while longer. What could be resolved more quickly was marriage issues. During this period, Quakers reaffirmed the Society's policy of endogamy. Marriages of members to persons outside the order were subjected to intense scrutiny and possible repudiation. Those who were joined in marriage by an outside priest was deemed contrary, quote, to the good order established among us. As a result of this, admonitions against disorderly walkers, as they were called, increased dramatically in the 1750s and 60s as erring friends who failed to change their ways after intense conversations with appointed committees of men and women were brought to task by public being disowned as a member of our religious order, end quote. This spiritual revival required women to be full participants in policing the ranks of membership. It renewed Fox's earlier stress on plainness in dress, speech, and emphasis on walking the straight and narrow path. As women's business meetings grew in importance with substantive agendas, the smaller or makeshift location of these venues no longer suited the status of these newly assumed women's meetings during this period of Quaker reform. The reinvigoration of Quaker business meetings had a profound effect on the arrangement of meeting houses, which first appeared in the Delaware Valley in the 1760s. Here, rather than the central one room for joint worship of men and women and a subsidiary space for women's business meetings, a new plan developed that consisted of two equal-sized rooms set side by side by a retractable partition in the center dividing the two spaces. Instead of a single doorway in the front, the main facade doubled in size with two entrances leading into each of these rooms. Men sat on one side and women on the other. It varied from place to place, so there was not women on the east and men on the west or vice versa. The equality of the genders in both spiritual and administrative affairs of the order was now enshrined in the architectural symmetry of the double meeting house plan. An early prototype of this plan appeared at the Exeter Meeting House, erected in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 1759. Do we see Berks up there? With walls in bluish-gray limestone, the one-story structure is 60 feet and 28 feet wide. The six-bay front or south facade contains a pair of entrance doors in the second and fifth bays, which are both flanked by windows on each side. The form doubles the traditional three-bay opening and is an architectural acknowledgement of the increasing significance of the role of women's business meetings in redefining the core values and identity of Friends in the late colonial period. Even so, the facade is not completely symmetrical and still betrays the earlier subordinate role that women played in the Quaker business affairs. The men's section on this western side is more prominent, with its hooded double doorway and windows that are more widely spaced compared to the women's side, which contains a single door with a more closely set pair of windows. On the rear north facade, the distinction is just as pronounced, as the men's section has a rear entrance door for elders and traveling friends with windows on either side set high in the wall to accommodate the tiered seating and facing benches. This is one of the first of these back doors that were built in a Quaker meeting house. Originally, the inside of the meeting was divided into two unequal rooms. The largest men's room was in the west, was a little over 20 feet in length and double tier of facing benches against the north wall. The women's meeting space was 18 feet in length and had no raised benches. It is likely that women met first for worship in the larger western room and then retired to the smaller one to conduct their business, as the old pattern still survived. A decade later, the first fully realized double meeting house plan was built by members of the Buckingham Monthly Meeting in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in 1768. At 65 feet, the two-story stone structure is slightly larger than the brick Nine Partners, and the 6 bay apertures on the front and back walls reflect the same rhythmic pattern of windows and doors. The 40-foot gable ends are pierced by 3 windows rather than 2 bays at Nine Partners, which is 3 feet wider. The double doors on the south front and the north facade are accentuated by deeply cantilevered pedimented hoods, a decorative characteristic of the Delaware Valley, as well as the gable end pence, which really didn't travel north of the Delaware Valley. There are subtle differences between the north and south facades. The more regular coursing on the south facade, along with the wider double doors, indicates that this is the front of the building. The double-sheaved doors are faced with vertical boards. On the north facade, the stonework is less regular and the doorways are narrower than the opposite side, yet these double doors are paneled. The ambivalent hierarchy characteristic of the tensions inherent in this new design. The doorways open into a space that is both unified and divided. The south side doorways had led into the main floor of the meeting, large gathering rooms with movable benches. A stairway in the southwest corners rise to the men's gallery on the west side in the building, and an identical staircase on the southeast side for the women's gallery. The gallery stretched along 4 walls, a 2-story partition composed of a series of wainscoted panels that could be opened and counterweighted with pulleys, divided the meeting house on the ground floor and in the gallery into 2 nearly equal-sized rooms. However, I should point out that the men's meeting is slightly more than 33 feet in width, while the women's meeting is 28 feet. Despite the inherent equality in the plan, for some reason, men who were entirely responsible for the design and construction of meeting houses always gave themselves a couple extra feet. Took too much place on the bed. The doorways on the north side are slightly higher than those on the south, which allow access to the raised benches that stretch across the entire wall of the ground floor. This triple row of benches were reserved for elders, ministers, and traveling friends, and had folding doors in both the men's and women's meeting so that clerks could record minutes of the separate business meetings with the partitions were lowered. Starting with the first appearance in the late 1750s, these meeting houses in the Delaware Valley, doorways to the facing benches were reserved solely for those who sat in the, while others entered through the south doorways located on the 2 gable ends. If the north doors provided access only to weighty friends, then the openings demonstrated a hierarchical order a sect that professed the equality of its members. These doorways leading to the elders' benches also clearly demonstrate the price paid for conformity. In hierarchical order of meetings, strengthening the Quaker discipline meant stricter regulations from yearly meetings downwards to pronouncements by these traveling friends who entered through the back doors. The symmetrical plan of the Buckingham meeting reflects this redefinition and defining moment of Quaker history. Though not every new meeting house built after Buckingham followed its pattern, over the next half century it served as the most popular model in the Delaware Valley. Nearby at Wrightstown Meeting House, a two-story stone building erected in 1787, it measures 65 feet by 40 feet. In the east, in New Jersey, a pair of brick monthly meeting houses matched the Buckingham design. The one in Salem County was built in 1772, and Chesterfield Meeting House at Crosswicks in Burlington County was completed the following year. Many of the older single-cell meeting houses in the region were doubled in size to conform to the new pattern of double symmetry. The stone Birmingham Meeting House in Chester, it should be snowy in this view. Is that right? Yeah. Yep. Is in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Started as a single three-bay type in 1763, but added two more bays in the early 19th century to create the five-bay facade and two side-by-side rooms divided by the central partition. In New Jersey, at Lower Alloways Creek in Salem County, erected a meeting house in 1756 that measured 30 by 26, and nearly 30 years later, they built a 24-foot addition to one side to create this pattern. In Cumberland County, Quakers built a 41 by 30-foot brick meeting house in the village of Greenwich, which they added 15-foot wing 20 years later. These lateral expansion allowed Quakers to add on to their old meeting houses in a way that preserved many of them from obsolescence. The Buckingham meeting double symmetry meeting house plan spread by the end of the 18th century elsewhere, north and south, because of a number of male and female friends who felt called to share their testimonies as missionaries to other meetings in America and in England. They no doubt spoke of the sufficiency of these new types where men and women shared spaces side by side. The word of the plan spread, and it was picked up here in the Hudson Valley. Before this time, Quakers who were members in New York and New England yearly meetings followed more traditional forms similar to those in the Mid-Atlantic colonies. In Newport, Rhode Island, a two-story, 45-foot square frame meeting house was built for the New England yearly meeting and the town's monthly meeting in 1699. In 1705, an ancillary building was constructed for the women's business meeting, but was torn down 2 decades later, and a new one measuring 35 feet in length and the same depth as the Great Meeting House was erected against the north wall to serve as the new meeting house for the women. The ground floor was heated by a chimney, and the second story was floored over and used for various purposes. This arrangement survived until 1807, when a new wing of the same size as the original meeting house was erected on the south side of it to become the new women's meeting house that served both for worship and business meetings. From the 1690s, where are we now? Flushing, that's great. That's where we should be. Welcome to Flushing. From the 1690s through the Revolution, the New York yearly meeting met in Flushing in Queens County, a center of early Quakerism since the third quarter of the 17th century. A frame meeting house was erected in 1694, but was replaced in 1717-1719 by the present wooden structure framed in 5 structural bays whose walls are covered in shingles. It measures 62 feet by 42 feet and is capped by a hip roof. Although much altered in the 19th century, structural evidence survives that indicates a solid partition wall once separated the building into two unequal rooms on the ground floor, 2 bays to the east and 3 bays to the west. It is likely that the smaller eastern room served as the meeting space for the women's business meetings during the New York yearly meetings, in addition to its monthly meetings, and that the larger room to the west served as general worship as well as for men's business meetings. This larger room originally contained a gallery and arched ceiling at the second floor level. The east room was not opened to the second story, but sealed over and floored contained a slightly smaller room used for a variety of purposes over the years. The meeting house was substantially altered in the early 19th century to open up the ground floor into large meeting space for worship and separate business meetings, with a new partition roughly centered in the building. The pattern set by these 2 yearly meetings were replicated throughout the rest of their jurisdictions. Here in Dutchess County, these older arrangements appeared in earlier meeting houses, which we'll see next week. In 1764, the monthly meeting, the oblong meeting house in Pauling, is a 2-story frame structure covered in shingles which measured 46 by 41 feet in width. Originally, the building consisted of a single doorway in the center of the long south facade and another doorway in the center of the east gable end, and probably a doorway in the center of the west gable end, which was moved at a later period closer to the southwest corner. These doors led into a large open ground floor room where there was no partition between men's and women's seating for worship. 2 rows of elders sat on the tiered platform against the north wall. Enclosed staircases on the southwest and southeast corners of the building provided access to an asymmetrical gallery above. The 2 westernmost bays of the gallery were partitioned off from the rest of the upper floor by vertical board sheathing, and you can see this if you go up there, hopefully it's still there, separating the women to hold their business upstairs while men transacted their business on the ground floor. Access to the enclosed gallery was from a narrow passage at the top of the staircase along the south wall. An exterior door led directly to the second floor chamber. The rest of the gallery consisted of a narrow well of 2 bays and was accessed by a separate staircase in the south wall. In the early 18th and 19th century, the interior was altered to conform to a more symmetrical division of the meeting house. Reordering probably grew out of the need to have a larger space for business meetings when oblong was designated as one of the venues for the region's quarterly meetings. The upstairs women's room was dismantled and the gallery was enlarged from 2 to 3 bays in width and a partition inserted in the middle of the building running from the north to the south wall. The central south door was enlarged to accommodate 2 doors, one on one side of the central partition and the other on the other. New tiered seating was installed on the 3 sides of the enlarged gallery. On the ground floor, the elders' bench on the north wall was reconfigured. On each side of the partition, the benches were divided into 2 sections with rows of steps in between to provide access. In addition, a 3rd row of benches was added to the men's and women's side from these, in front of these 2 upper rows. The 2-story crumb elbow meeting, do you see?
You have to go back one.
You're 1 slide ahead where you think.
Where am I now?
Now you're crumb elbow.
I'm at crumb elbow, where I should be. Yeah, exterior crumb elbow. Good, thank you. House built in the town of Hyde Park in the 1790s now appears to be a symmetrical meeting house, but in fact started out as an irregular plan. The western section of this 2-story frame building is original. Its form was unusual in that it was deeper than it was long. The front and rear walls are 24 feet in length, 10 feet shorter than the 30-foot wide gable ends. Although some of the original arrangement had been lost, the asymmetrical plan probably consisted of a central doorway on the south wall and a secondary entrance on the east gable end, all set to the north. The stairs to the gallery rose along the east wall toward the south. An elder's bench was located against the north wall. A partition running to the west wall to the east, 19.5 feet from the south entrance, divided the lower room into separate spaces, one for men and one for women's business meetings. You excited about that one? Okay. The interior, and it shows men and women spelled out? No. It's the plan? Is it the change plan? Could be the change plan. Is it a change plan? Forward? Now you're excited. Okay, good. It's always good to have unanimity. Anyway, so it gets changed around 1810 to create the symmetrical arrangement. You get the pattern here, right? Although 9 partners ushered in the new era of double symmetry, it was quickly followed by other meeting houses, including Creek Meeting House in the same period, an offshoot of 9 partners whose original plan was altered at a later period. Still surviving, nearly intact, is the one-story Oswego Meeting House. We're at Creek. All right, now we're at Oswego. No, yeah. It's getting tired. Anyway, all right. So Oswego is another one. It's a nice early symmetrical plan. I think you get the story here, right? All right. I would like to close this presentation by returning to Maryland's Third Haven Meeting House Committee, charged with addressing issues of drowsiness at Quaker meetings. Long after their earlier report, they recorded, quote, they had proceeded in the services so far as a way opened, which being considered the meeting appears most easily to discontinue them at present. In other words, after 5 years, people are still falling asleep. In other words, they acknowledge the inability of its members to overcome the soporific effects of hours spent in silent contemplation. Third Haven was not alone, as minutes from other meetings also recorded the dimming of the inner light was an endemic problem faced by Quakers wherever they met. This may explain why no one was here heard the boys whittling away upstairs in their pocket knives gallery here at 9 Partners. What was in the realm of reform at the third Quaker meeting was the members' attempt to bring their old meeting house, which I said was the oldest meeting house that survives in America, the oldest Quaker meeting house that survived from 1680s. Although not as handsome as this building, I hope this is this building. The meeting house, the oldest surviving one, erected a century before 9 Partners, was altered in 1797. It was expanded to create a double symmetrical entrance, 2 equal-sized rooms, and refitted with new benches and extensions of the facing benches dividing by a central partition. These renovations brought it up to standards that by the end of the 18th century expressed the equality of men and women in prayer and in overseeing the affairs of those who called themselves friends. Thank you. And thank all of you for your participation in keeping me going. And I might drink a little water.
You have a question. Hold on 1 second, Carolyn. So before we take questions, while you're thinking about questions, 3 things that I forgot to mention during the introduction. First, this would not have been possible without funding from Dutchess County. This is part of Dutchess County's Rev250. So we thank the county legislature, right, for approving that funding. Second, there are snacks, right? So take advantage of that. And third, I know most of you, when you came in, signed in at the little guest book, the door over here. If you came in late or if you snuck in this door, would you just mind signing in there so we can keep track of how many people came and where they came from and where you heard about it? It's all part of like the grant process for the county. Caroline, you have a question?
Not a question.
Can I give you the mic?
Yeah. Point of interest, I think. It so happens that currently the New York yearly meeting is being held in Poughkeepsie this weekend, right now. So the Quakers, even though you're hearing about the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, do what? Oh, closer? Oh, I've never used one before. I usually, yeah. Anyway, Quakers are still around and active and hold the same tenets as they always did. And then you might be interested to know that the Bull's Head meeting next Sunday will hold the quarterly meeting, what's called the Nine Partners Quarterly Meeting, which used to be here, but if you have any curiosity or interest, join us next Sunday at 10:30, and we'll have snacks afterward too. So we'll compete for snacks.
Other questions?
Thank you. With women and men meeting, having their business meetings separately, did they, is it on? Yeah. With having their meetings separately, did they ever get together after those meetings and mingle their ideas?
Well, they had to communicate back and forth, and they would send over their minutes and review each. Well, I don't know if this is true of all, but the ones that I've looked at, and I've spent a lot of time looking at business meeting, they're not as riveting as drowsiness, but nonetheless, they would review what they said, and they would join together if there were joint issues that they had to deal with. But in terms, they some ways they divided some of the issues about domestic issues like marriage. That mainly occurred in the women's meeting, but not always. Sometimes the men would bring that up and discuss that. And what they often did then, if they found somebody not walking the straight and narrow path, they would form a committee, and that committee was often men and women together, if necessary, to go visit that person or persons to find out what they were willing to do and point out what they're not doing correctly. So that's how they commingled to
So after they did that,
yes.
Did they ever go out into the wider community and try to implement some of the ideas that they had come to a conclusion about?
You mean like the social issues?
Yes.
They didn't mind lecturing in some places, that's correct, but they were more concerned about discipline themselves, to speak as one voice on slavery, one voice on taking up arms, one voice in participating in government, one voice in not, social manners like not taking off your hat when you come into the meeting.
So you're saying that was all internal?
That was internal, but they published. So they published lots of pamphlets, saying, this is slavery is wrong, and here's why we believe that. And that was widely published, and it was, they didn't hide the fact that they were Quakers doing it.
How would they distribute their printed material?
You have to ask Ben Franklin, I think, or publishers. But they would go to a printer and have them, but they would circulate these letters and everything. I mentioned even the people in London, which was a very powerful yearly meeting. I mean, that was sort of like the central Quaker, if there is such a thing as a central Quaker. And those letters every year would come to different yearly meetings. And then, as I mentioned here, they would then copy them and hand them down to the quarterly meetings, from the quarterly meetings to the monthly meetings, and from the monthly to the local meetings. So every Quaker knew what was going on. And then those people who came by to make new announcements, and they could be frivolous announcements too, like no longer can you wear 3 feathers in your bonnet, you can only wear 1. That was decided by the yearly meeting in Philadelphia in the 1760s. But, there are also these very grave matters, too. So all the Quakers, they're trying to get them on the same page, and that's why that meant greater discipline. That means greater reform. That means unanimity, which means the period of reform is the greatest period of disownment. More people left the Quaker meeting in this era of great buildings because they refused to accept the fact that they're telling them who they can marry. They refused to accept the fact that they're doing something that's outside what the Quakers frowned on. And so it was a great, so the meetings kept growing, and then all of a sudden, at this moment of reform, they turned back in on themselves and became very sectarian. Sectarian meaning, they're very distinctive. Before that time in the early 18th century, a lot of them had just allowed the ways of the world to affect both how they dealt in business practices as well as other things. And they were very concerned about business practices that they regulated among the men's meeting, like you're overcharging that person, or they need a fair, it's almost like today, this corn was picked by non-slaves or something like that. So there was that kind of stuff, but it was mainly focused on the inside. They're not like they were in the 17th century when they were a very strange group, often taking off all their clothes and running through the streets, saying all is vanity. I mean, they were among the many sects that came out of the English Revolution. I mean, it opened a lid on religion in the 1640s and 50s. There were all these groups, and the Quakers responded to that, and the Quakers actually grew in areas where the Anglican Church was not very strong. So in the north of England, where those parishes are very large and they didn't have pastoral care as much, there were a lot of people turned to the Quakers because they could, they didn't need hireling priests, as they were called, and they could have their meetings together. And that's where they, just like in eastern North Carolina, in Rhode Island, and in Maryland, Maryland had a policy of toleration, but it was not really toleration, which meant we don't want to pay any attention to religion. And when that happens, that's when the Quakers moved into that area, and they took over a group that had been disaffected Puritans from Virginia who had moved up there. And all of a sudden, they became Quakers, and they're sort of the start of the Quakers. So that's how they took advantage, and then they grew, and then they started narrowing down and down in the 18th and 19th century.
Thank you.
Yes?
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi. I love seeing all the architectural plans, and I'm just curious about how the women's side is covered over.
Yeah.
But then I see there's sort of pockets for joists here that you could cover it over. So can you talk about that a
Again,
little bit?
when the meeting declines in population, it's no longer necessary to have all this space. So they close it down for warmth and everything else. So that was very common. Or in later times, and when they do begin to give up on the idea of segregating men and women in the 19th century, that's when you see a lot of this. And one of the rooms will become a school room or a refreshments room or library, and they would only use one side. And they don't need the galleries anymore because there are fewer and fewer of them. So that's how they close these things off. Yes, sir.
Hold on, John. Hold on. Just talking to
Manumission? Okay. Did they just absorb the financial loss when they manumitted their slaves?
Yes. But in a way that Quakers can help out those who might be affected by the, and there was a lot of pressure on Quakers to give up their slaves. And, and you look through the minutes in the 1740s, even before this Great Reform period, there's pushing it, that you might see that, they put the pressure on them, and someone will say, I can't afford to do that. I'll lose my farm. I can't do this. I can't, whatever. And they might take up a collection to help this guy and basically pay for the partially pay to manumit that person would happen. Because they did work as a group, always working, taking collections up. That's how they built these meeting houses. It was not built just by the people here at Nine Partners Meeting House. They were throughout the area of the monthly and quarterly meetings. They would take collections up and they would give them to the people at Nine Partners to build their meeting house. That's why so many meeting houses survive, is because it was a group effort. It was a group effort to do that. Yes.
Can we do one or two more questions?
Apparently, a school was established in this meeting house in 1796, and I wonder whether that continued.
Someone who knows this better, I don't know about,
And
but there is a school
many of the
here.
meeting houses had schools in them?
Yes, they did. They had schools or next to them.
Okay.
Because again, they were concerned about, they were, very concerned about being who they are. And they would prefer to go to their own schools. And so you do start, I think the Birmingham meeting house that I showed you, there's still a early 19th century school building right there, right next to the meeting house. And that would have been very common. Yeah, so the one here fits in with that pattern.
Yeah, so the one here closed by the 1860s, but Oakwood Friends School, where the yearly meeting is being held right now, is kind of like the descendant of that. Traces its origins back to Nine Partners here in the 1790s. Is there one? Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'm here from the Creek meeting, as are a few other people, and you flashed our meeting house briefly, and I would just like to say to the group here that we're in the midst of... Oh, sorry, okay, I'm speaking about the Creek meeting, and that we're doing, we've done a recent historic structures report on it as part of the restoration of the interior, which was lost in the early 20th century. And what I've learned is quite interesting, which is that the people from the New York Queen Street meeting went down to Buckingham in 1773 and studied it, came back, apparently built the first double-planned meeting house in New York, and then, and that's long since lost, but we believe that the Creek from 1777 would have been the second, and that while the rebuilding was being done for the Nine Partners for about 6 months was meeting in the Creek Meeting House before it, in fact, was finished in 1780. So there are very close relationships between these, and I just wanted to give a shout out for the Creek.
It's good to do that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was last here 15 years ago, so it hadn't had all that new work that you talk about. But the one great thing is how ecumenical many denominations were. In case a building burned, sometimes courthouses would be used for church meetings or meeting house meetings, Quaker meetings, or use of other denominational buildings they would work out some arrangement to do that. So that's the good side about American history, that there was that idea that you got to help somebody out when they're in destitute like that. So that's great to hear that.
I have another statement of sorts. I want to respectfully disagree with the response to the inquiry regarding what did the Quakers do with their activism and their principles. The Quakers always, and continue to live their principles, so that they were responsible for a great deal of prison reform. A woman, Elizabeth Fry, went to prisons herself and brought about some prison reform. The women's vote was largely brought about by Quaker women. Lucretia Mott, in particular, was here at the school, which was the first co-ed boarding school in the country. And so the alternatives to violence, and Quakers write to their political people all the time. They write to prisoners. And they oppose the death penalty, and they've done that out loud and respectfully, peacefully. They were accompanying Martin Luther King, so they've been very active always. That's
I agree entirely with you, but this, I only go up barely into the 19th century, so you're covering the past 200 years, which is, renewal. I mean, like I say, Quakers renew themselves time and time again. And so I agree entirely with you.
All right, I just want to thank everyone for coming. Let's give another round of applause here to Carl.
Thank you.
And have some
Have a
snacks
good-
or
yes.
sign in if you didn't sign in the guest book.